Number 5. The hospital I worked at had its mental health facility detached from the main building. To get to it, you have to walk down the hill from the main building. The outbuilding it's in is 2 stories. The upper part is for officers and the lower is the patient area. We have 2 sections, A and B. Section A is for the more severe cases of mental illness, and Section B is for the more mild forms, including people who have made suicide attempts. Every time I was sent down there, I worked in Section A. The first part of the procedures for the day was getting the keys from the security guards. Every door in the facility was to remain closed and locked so the patients couldn't escape. If you needed to leave and a door was blocked by a patient, or they were nearby enough that they could potentially slip out with you, you had to find another way around or wait for them to leave. This happened a few times to me, but it was never really much of a problem. The second thing about the procedures that made this a difficult place to work was how we cleaned the rooms. We had to take our housekeeping cart and wheel it into the doorway to block the patients from coming in while we worked. While we were cleaning, we had to keep an eye on our carts to make sure patients didn't come up and pull things out of them. A few years before, a patient actually tried to drink some of the cleaning agents off of another housekeeper's cart. The third procedure, it dealt with if a patient cornered you or attacked you. This was a very rare occurrence, but had happened in the past. As we were not allowed to defend ourselves if such an event happened, we would have to yell for a security guard, a doctor, or a nurse. If that didn't work, we would have to try and talk the patient down ourselves, or find a way to escape from them without using violence. I was thankfully never attacked, but working there was unsettling, and one of the most difficult things I've had to do to date. My first week working down there was a woman who refused to put her clothes on. They had her locked in the solitary confinement for 3 days because of it. The confinement rooms were down a small hallway with large glass doors. They would take unruly patients in there and strap them down to these padded reclining chairs until whatever problem they had created was resolved. They had cameras in the room to monitor the patients, but due to the nudity of the woman, they kept a sticky note over the screen and would lift it up every once in a while to see how she was doing. But the worst patient for me, personally, was there for the entire time I worked down there. He would talk to himself, which was normal for most of the patients. He usually sat in the common area, and oftentimes when I had to go near him, I was behind the chair he was sitting in, cleaning, and he was facing an empty chair talking to nobody in particular. and all of a sudden he would let out this strained, loud laugh and scream at the chair.
"Shut up, pig."
And then he just relaxed again. I hurried away as the situation freaked me out. Another day, this same man was humming to himself. It was a Christian song like one learned in Sunday school. He was laying down, and then he just went stiff as a board, and he started screaming. I was mopping in the area again, and it startled me. I glanced at him, and he continued to yell. I heard him say,
"Stop it, Satan!"
before I left the area. I was never hurt, attacked, or cornered by any of the patients, thank God for that, but working in that place was spooky, and I was grateful when my boss finally told me I would never have to work down there ever again.
Number 4.
This happened a few months ago. I was severely ill, seeing doctors and counsellors about my mental health state. I suffered with depression and deep cutting. I was nowhere near happy in life. Early hours in the morning, at around 2 a.m, when everyone was asleep, I climbed out of the house and around to the front, making sure not to awaken my parents and my 2 dogs, Arthur and Tyson. It was around Christmas time, and living in England, our snow always came late, but due to feeling suicidal at the time, I ran down our long deserted road, which looked like an airport runway. I ran to a near bridge, having the intention to jump and end it all, but after reaching the bridge and climbing over the railings, near slipping due to all the railings being iced up, I looked down to see nothing but a 100-foot drop. At this moment in time, my parents had noticed me missing, and after checking on me, I wasn't there, so she reported me missing and told the police everything about my illness and what I was suffering at the time. I was admitted to a mental health unit later that night in Nottingham. I was placed on a Section 3, so I couldn't leave the building until 6 months. So I was already angry that I didn't jump at the time, and I had to stay in a hospital ward with 11 more ill patients. After being walked down the corridor to my room, I attempted to run, even though I knew that the unit was a lockdown building with little to run to. Well, I finally got to sleep after having 2 members of staff watching me. A few days prior, I was put on medication which had a side effect of weird dreams and nightmares. I had a fucked up dream that I was slicing my own body up with a meat knife, almost like I was another person with no care about anyone. After finally being morning, although a little shaken, I thought nothing of the dream. So I got out of bed, walked to the room where all the medication is and where our blood pressure was taken. Sitting there, waiting for my turn, Dane, one of the patients, walked up to me and said the following words that made my blood turn cold.
"I like the butcher knife. Try a sword next time."
I answered,
Okay.
thinking he was making some sort of joke that I didn't get. After he walked and sat on the chair across from me, he gave me this weird clown look. I felt like being sick. He walked back down to his room and came back with a piece of paper a moment later, which he placed on the seat next to me. He said to me,
"It's for you. Sleep well."
I opened it up to see a man sliced open, with another man laughing with a big butcher knife in his hand. The staff around me automatically took the paper and placed it in their pocket. I just thought that he was ill, so I tried to forget about it that night, but I woke up needing the toilet. I told the staff and they took me down as I wasn't allowed in a room alone in case I tried the worst. I opened the door, only to fall to the floor, crying, seeing Dane. He had cut his throat with a razor. The staff immediately pulled their pin. It was a tag, and when they tugged it, it set off an alarm to all the staff that they needed help ASAP. They picked him up and tried to help him whilst he laid there, lifeless. His stuff was being packed in the morning. He was either moving to a more secure ward, or he had passed on. I never asked, I just cried, remembering what I witnessed that night. A few months after though, he was admitted again. Miraculously, he had survived that night. Again, he knocked on my door.
"Dane?"
I said, shocked.
I thought that you were past? No, apparently I was lucky.
He then whispered to me the following words.
"You made me do this. You will die and pay."
He gave me that same fucked up clown-like smile. Then he walked off into his old room. I fell asleep uneasily that night, but I was awoken to him trying to strangle me. I was coughing up spit trying to get some air. He was laughing, saying the words,
"You made me do it. You take him with you."
I was freaking out, gasping for air. But eventually, through the struggle, some of the nurses eventually came in and took him off of me. He was taken away, and I never heard about him again. I didn't talk to another patient for 4 months, and then I was discharged. I have hoped every night since that day that Dane got better. I work hard on my mental health now. I'm at the gym 6 days a week, and I work. I'm living a pretty good life now, but what happened in that unit still haunts me, and I hope I never see or run into him again.
Number 3.
This is a story about how I found myself trapped in a mental hospital over 1,100 miles away from my home. It's a long, complicated story, so please bear with me. During my first semester of college, I stayed in the campus dorms with one roommate. I had left my home in the southern United States and traveled west to Arizona. My roommate was a small, quiet guy with long stringy hair covering his face. For now, I'll call him Chase. At first, we appeared to be interested in the same things, and I was optimistic that we would be good friends. As time went on, his pessimistic attitude began to show though. I should have expected to be out of place at the school, being a gay 18 artist in a school mostly of heterosexual male programmers and nerds. But out of place doesn't begin to describe how the other students saw me. My friendliness and optimism were perceived by other students as ignorant. My roommate especially saw my attitude towards life and people as blissful ignorance. It was probably for this reason that Chase started to become increasingly bitter and aggressive towards me. He began telling me I deserved to be set on fire for my taste in movies, my computer preferences, and other petty things. As he showered one day, I had noticed files left open on his computer which involved drawn comics of father-child pornography. I know, I'm pretty nosy. Anyway, I kept my discovery to myself at the time. Honestly, I didn't know what to do with my newfound perspective on my roommate. Still, his attraction to the idea of pedophilia and incest made me extremely uncomfortable. During one of his unpredictable snaps towards me, I let slip in front of our friends the content I had seen. He appeared disturbed by my audacity to snitch on him in front of other people, and after a few days, he moved out of the dorms. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him and his bad-mouthing me. That is, until an upperclassman I'll call Jeff entered my life. Jeff was a tall, thin guy who I'd often see rolling around on campus on rollerblades. We chatted a bit in passing from time to time about rollerblading and Arizona, even though I knew he was a friend of Chase's. I initially thought he was pretty harmless. I wasn't about to judge others based on the company they keep. This was my second big mistake. About a week into my second semester of college, I began to notice Jeff in the student dorms more often, even though he didn't live there and would have needed a key to get in. Eventually, he began grabbing me in public, and on one occasion, pinned me against a wall and began pressing himself against me. In many instances, I was caught too off guard to tell him to piss off. It was humiliating. Jeff began to follow me more as time passed, and Chase would often brag about these pranks he convinced Jeff to pull on me. As the slight annoyance began to evolve into full-on sexual harassment, I noticed that Chase would often appear after Jeff had finished harassing me. The final straw for me was an occasion in which I was working in the school's computer lab. There was a fair amount of people around, so I hadn't expected Jeff and Chase to show up and bully me. Jeff approached me, interrupting my conversation with another student in order to forcibly grab my thigh and begin moaning and laughing. At least before, his creepy teasing had been fairly private, but now he had the entire room's attention. I tried to make a joke to hide my humiliation.
"Okay, that's enough of that. Go find someone else to be your human stress ball."
I gave a fake laugh. In reaction to this, he forcefully grabbed at my crotch and quickly licked my face like an excited dog. I managed to push him off and stand up. He gave me a creepy smirk and began muttering homophobic slurs at me. I had enough of this bullshit, so I chucked my computer's keyboard at him and spit on his face. He began to twitch violently as everyone watched in confusion. He grabbed me by the neck and dug his thumbs into my throat. At that moment, the look in his eyes, it didn't even appear human. Finally, a student spoke up.
Get your fucking hands off of him.
Jeff let go of my neck immediately, the animalistic look leaving his eyes as he walked over to Chase and the two left the room. I spent the next week talking to the RA about the harassment I had been tolerating for way too long. Students had told me they had seen Jeff on campus waving a knife around and bragging about how he was going to slit my throat. And, to my surprise, I wasn't the only student to report Jeff for sexual and physical harassment. Jeff was one of the best programmers at the school, and because of this, most of the faculty turned a blind eye to his harassment. They would all say,
"Oh, Jeff, that's just him being weird."
I had enough of this school and its bullshit excuses for justifying death threats and assaults, so I spoke to the school one last time. It was then that I found out that I was being expelled for spitting on Jeff.
What do you mean? I never touched the guy. He grabbed me. He choked me and threatened to kill me.
I pleaded to the school counselor. She began rambling on about how Jeff was such a smart student and that I was taking things too seriously. Frustrated, I told her that I would rather bash my head against a wall than have to deal with the morons at this school. Suddenly, I heard a demanding voice addressing me. A police officer entered the room and immediately put me in handcuffs.
"Okay, son, you've made a threat to endanger yourself. You have to come with us."
Panicking, I looked back at the counselor. Through my tears and utter shock, I could see that she was also crying. The next thing I know, I was driving to an industrial-looking building with the letters UPC displayed beside the door. I discovered quickly that this wasn't a jail or a hospital. It was basically a holding facility for the mentally ill, composed of only 2 rooms. UPC stood for Urgent Psychiatric Care. In reality though, there was no caring of these patients. I was assigned a reclining plastic-lined chair and a blanket which was lined up with dozens of other identical chairs in a single room. This would be where I sat, ate and slept for the next 2 weeks. No faculty members spoke to me for the first 2 days. I was given no context to what was happening to me or where I was, so I spent these first 2 days crying non-stop. Once I finally began to pull myself out of my hysteria on the second day, I noticed all the levels of mental illness around me, from the depressed to the violently insane. On my first night, the elderly blind woman next to me began to vomit undigested food profusely and was left covered in her own vomit for a good half hour before an inconvenienced nurse finally got off her cell phone and wheeled the woman away. I later discovered the man in the chair to my other side was a Crip gang member with obvious noose burns around his neck. A presumably homeless man would walk around talking about the devil. The nurses would completely ignore him, and sometimes I would hear him laughing at the patients. I awoke several nights to the sounds of screaming. For a long time, no one knew where I was. Eventually though, I was able to use a phone and quickly explain my situation to my parents. Towards the end of my time there, I had almost grown used to being woken to the sounds of screaming and could get back to sleep relatively easily. I sat in the same set of clothes for the entire time, rotting away in a chair, being laughed at by rude nurses as if I were an ape in a zoo. I probably smelled like an animal at that point too, considering I was too afraid to shower publicly, particularly after the previous events with Jeff. After some time, I was finally told I was going to be transferred to an actual hospital. On one of my last days in that room, I witnessed a wandering homeless man pull down his pants and he started masturbating into the face of another patient. The nurses tackled him to the ground, and soon after, I was transferred to a real hospital. After this, things were surprisingly calmer at the actual hospital. I was able to bathe, talk to the staff, and read for the next month while doctors attempted to get me into the right balance of antidepressants. After a month of being in actual hospital, I was deemed by a judge not to be a danger to myself or anyone else. And just like that, I was released and able to drive back east to be with my family. Over the next week, I received emails and phone calls from multiple people. The head of the Student Alliance informed me that Jeff and Chase had been receiving backlash from other students. They were also starting up an anti-bullying campaign. The school president called to apologize for the incident and offered me a refund for my unfinished semester. The school counsellor and administration called to inform me of their intentions to sue should I tell anyone about the events that transpired. And for a year afterwards, I told no one. I still haven't told my family about the sexual harassment either. After 3 years, I'm finally moving on from the event. A few months back, I was fairly certain I actually saw Chase running an artist table at a local convention. He didn't notice me, thankfully. He had the same long stringy hair and miserable expression I can so vividly remember. Seeing his face doesn't bother me anymore though. In the end, I learned a lot about people. And sometimes, the people we're forced to trust most don't deserve to be trusted at all.
Number 2.
This story might come across as your typical scary psych ward patient tale, but to this day, I've never encountered anyone else like this. I hope I never do. I admit, I've suffered with mental illness all of my life. I've been admitted to several psychiatric hospitals throughout the years, but I'm not the scary one in this story. There's a lot of stigma surrounding the mentally ill, but despite what a lot of people think, most people who suffer with psychological issues aren't dangerous. But the man I'm about to tell you is the exception. I'd managed to stay out of hospital for years, but in my early 20s, I had a bit of a breakdown and became very suicidal. I won't go into the details of why, but let's just say I've had a lot of trauma in my life, but those are perhaps scary tales for another time. I ended up being carried, yes, carried, by a very large, very patient cop into the ER after letting it slip to my doctor that I just wanted to end it all. I'm only 5 foot and around 98 pounds, so this guy picked me up very easily. The ward I was then transferred to was a very cliché psychiatric unit. For some reason I'll never understand, they make most psych wards cold and bright white with hard, unforgiving floors and mattresses that make it feel like you're sleeping on a slab of concrete. The food is terrible, which all certainly doesn't help one be less suicidal, and the only thing to do was to watch cable or play cards with the other patients. Thankfully, I ended up really connecting with a lot of other patients, particularly a man named Michael. I think it may have had something to do with us both being feisty redheads. Gingers tend to bond with each other because we can empathise with all the shots people like to take at us. Just because all the redheads I've ever met happen to be a little crazy doesn't mean anything though, right? Anyways, Michael and I were playing cards. We were playing a game called Speed, and we heard a nurse say we had a new patient coming in. Hesitantly, we both decided to take a peek to see who it was. It's important to know that, unfortunately, they don't always separate the more severely disturbed patients with the ones who are non-violent. They tend to just throw you all in one big pile, labelled the crazy pile, and I guess I just don't want to waste the energy thinking about the possible horrifying consequences of not caring. I'm not saying all hospitals and medical professionals are this callous towards the mentally ill, but unfortunately, there are some. That's one of the hardest things about being mentally ill, is that most people don't want to deal with you, and even go as far as thinking as you're a monster or a broken doll who would be thrown away and forgotten about. For the record though, there are a lot of very caring nurses, doctors, and others who make it their mission to help people like this, and treat you with a lot of care and respect. This was not one of those hospitals though. Anyway, looking down the hallway, I felt my heart drop into my toes, as I saw the new arrival. His appearance was as intense and disturbing as the look of pure hate and malice he was shooting everyone around him. He had long, greasy black hair that spilled just a little past his shoulders. He was bone thin everywhere except his stomach, which protruded out so much he looked at least 7 months pregnant. I swear he was male though. However, the most noticeable and unnerving thing about him were his claw-like nails that I'll never forget were painted bright blue. His eyes were also an icy blue that felt like they could pierce right through you. His hospital gown was barely holding onto his skeletal frame. I remember desperately trying to reconcile this man's presence in my head, but there was just no way. Even just at 20, I'd seen a lot of crazy people, but this guy was by far the most unsettling. I think even people in Walmart would look at this guy like, holy shit. Looking at Michael, I could tell he was freaking out pretty bad too. The reason behind this freaking out was because we'd both been there a few days and knew that this particular hospital barely monitored their patients, and this guy was going to just be set loose among us. Now, I know you shouldn't judge others based on their appearance, but his actions over the next few days really didn't help his creepy factor. He spent most of the day just wandering down the hallways and running one freaky claw-like nail against the sterile walls. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't they make him cut his nails, as they could clearly be used as a weapon? The reason was he would completely lose it whenever they tried, and once again, this particular hospital just doesn't give a crap. When he wasn't doing this, he would just sit there and stare at the rest of us with a disturbingly, almost hungry look in his eyes. He wouldn't speak. He would just stare while clacking his nails on the arm of the chair. He would also wander into everyone else's room and just stand there in the middle of it and wait for someone to come in. When he did, he would just stare at them and put one of his skeletal fingers up to his lips to silence them before lunging towards them. I mean, this was totally something straight out of a horror movie, but I swear to you, it was real. I've learned that reality tends to be much more terrifying than anything Hollywood can come up with. Now, during all of this, I just did my best to avoid him, but one day I did something to bring a lot of attention to myself. This psych ward was unique. It had an old piano in the main room for patients to tinker with as they desired. My trade in life is music, although I'm mainly a vocalist. I can, however, memorize some decently complicated piano pieces. We were all so bored and miserable at where we were, so I figured music would be much more healing than cable TV. So, one evening, I decided to give the dusty old piano a shot. Everyone seemed really shocked when I just started playing and singing a lullaby I'd written. I guess I'd never mentioned I could play before, so that probably contributed to the surprise. I felt really happy again for the first time in a long time when I saw how delighted the other patients and even the nurses were with my performance. They begged me to play everything I knew, and I happily obliged. The one bad thing though is when I finished, I noticed Mr. Blue Nails staring at me very intently. I now seemed to be very much the focus of his attention. I tried to shake it off, but I became very much more aware of his location, which turned out to be a very good thing. Later that night, I had to go to my room to use the bathroom. When I was finished, I casually opened the door, and of course, who was now standing right in my face? You guessed it, I'm sure. Mr. Blue Nails. To my horror, instead of putting his finger over his lips like he usually did, he did something much worse. He spoke. I say it was much worse because his voice was just as unstable as the rest of him. In a creepy, low whisper, he said,
"Sing for me."
Nope, yep, just no. Thankfully, being super tiny doesn't just mean you're easy to pick up, it also makes you very adept at dodging and slipping through small spaces. So, as he came at me, it actually wasn't too hard to duck under his arms and bolt from the room. I immediately ran over to Michael and proceeded to freak out for a minute. I told the nurses, and they just told me that he doesn't understand what proper boundaries are. I shot back that considering he was constantly trying to pounce on everyone like a jungled cat,
No shit, he has no boundary issues. Can you please pay a little more attention to him?
Also, I know as someone who also suffers with mental issues, I should be more sensitive to his condition. But I grew up in a tough environment, and I know the difference between someone who doesn't understand anything they're doing to someone with a violent intent in their eyes. Fortunately, just a day later, he was transferred to the state hospital after losing his temper about taking his medicine and trying to stab the nurse with a syringe. You can't refuse to take your meds in the psych ward. If you don't cooperate, they'll hold you down and eject them straight into you. Yeah, he didn't like that. I myself was released a day after he was, and I'm not sure whatever happened to Mr. Blue Nails, but I must admit, I have wondered about him sometimes. It's been several years since this happened, and I'm happy to say I'm doing a lot better now. I've been hospitalized again, but I've never encountered any other patient quite like him.
Number 1.
I used to work as an intern at a psych hospital in California a couple of years ago. I have many stories about my time there, but I'll start off with this one for now. I was going to school to study psychology and found a hospital with a great program to continue my studies. I had just finished orientation and was going to start my first day the next day. I was nervous but also extremely excited as I love psychology and people. I was assigned to the unit 210. This particular unit held 15 patients that had borderline personality disorder, bipolar, and/or schizophrenia. I unlocked the door to the unit and was immediately greeted by a couple of patients walking up and down the long hallway. My first greeting was from a man that shouted that he was going to rape and then decapitate me. Now, I'm not the most intimidating person. I'm a 5-foot petite part Asian girl that probably looked like I had no business being there. Being that I looked a bit timid, I had to shake it off like I didn't give a shit.
No, you won't do that.
Anyway, illegible scribbles and pentagrams covered the walls. It smelt of urine, and I can hear screaming down the hall. The doors of their rooms had those little windows you can peep in. Bare white halls, bare white beds, and no windows to the outside. The psychologist I was shadowing introduced me to the patients and nurses I would be working with. This one girl, let's call her Katie, came up to say hello and started making conversation with me. Naive me, assuming she was a fellow intern or volunteer because she was in regular clothes and seemed normal, I asked if she was an intern as well. This was a rookie mistake. I should have looked for her badge, which all staff members have. She smiled, looked at me straight in the eyes.
Yes.
I tell her I'm excited to be working with her. A few minutes later, Mary instructs me to gather the patients together for their art group. I ask her if I can go get Katie to help gather everyone. She says,
Of course. You will also be working close to Katie. Please, read her file after art group.
I'm thinking, file? Art group starts, and lo and behold, Katie, she's a patient. I later read her file, and she has schizophrenia with a long history of being a pathological liar. When Mary said I would be working close to her, that meant that I would be shadowing Katie one-on-one and recording her progress every day that I am working. I was in charge of making sure Katie was doing her chores, making her bed, tidying up her room, hygiene, attending her groups, and finishing her assignments. Besides her telling me that big fat lie, Katie came off as a really nice and sweet person. As we sat there, painting, she shared a bit of her life story and we had some laughs. She said,
Belle, I'm glad you're here. I've always wanted a sis and a friend. We even kind of look alike. I'm gonna draw you.
A couple of weeks of working there, all was great. One Tuesday, I came in to get Katie for her math lesson. I knocked on her door to her room and she excitedly emerged. I took a step back though, and my eyes widened. Her long waist-length black hair was cut into an A-line.
I had staff cut my hair into your style. Now we really look like sisters.
I didn't know what to say, but
looks good, Katie.
Then things took a turn from there. Katie's personality and mood started to fluctuate and change as time went on. She would tell me all these stories of us when we were younger.
Belle, remember that one time we were in kindergarten and we got in trouble together? It's crazy how long we've been friends. I could never get rid of you.
I would always try redirecting the conversation, and she would always say,
You still have that bad memory like you did when you were a child. You're so silly.
She became extremely attached to me and even jealous when I would talk to other patients, saying things like,
Stay away from Bella today. She has mono. Bella can't talk to you this week. She has laryngitis.
And the most dangerous one,
Bella doesn't like you.
So I won't give anyone else any attention. This caused patients to confront me as to why I didn't like them. One day, I poked my head into her room to make sure her bed was made. She was sitting on her neat bed facing the wall, sitting and staring so intently. I looked at her walls. My name was written everywhere. I notified staff immediately, and it was later cleaned up, but they shrugged it off. She said,
I just didn't want to forget you when you weren't here is all. They can wash you off the walls, but they can't wash you out of my mind.
Katie eventually went over the edge one day when she found out that I would have another patient, Chris, to tutor. She was so resentful and became really nasty towards me. She had all staff as well as patients calling her Belle. I explained to her that she would still be working with me, and she just snarled.
You're not Belle anymore. I am. I'll erase you. Go fuck Chris. You will lose your mind before you leave here.
A week or two went by without any incident. I had just finished my shift and was ready to go home for Thanksgiving weekend. I was walking down the empty long hallway out of the unit when Katie jumped out of nowhere and shoved me into one of the rooms that was supposed to be locked. The room with the bare white walls, the bare white bed and small peep window. I fell into the cold, hard ground into the room. I immediately jumped to get to the door, but she was on the other side pulling it. She was screaming that I will never leave and that she'll make sure of it.
Go lay in the bed. It's your bed now.
I push the emergency button on my keys that sets off the unit's alarm, but it doesn't go off. Unlocked doors and broken alarm button. Just my luck. I tell her to let go of the door, but she refused and shouted that I was the crazy one that belongs in there.
Where are the staff though?
We continue playing tug of war with the door for what felt like hours when Chris, my wonderful math student, came to rescue and shoved her out of the way from the door to let me out. The alarm finally went off and staff came rushing over. I was shaken up, but Katie had to be dragged away, all the while screaming,
I will get rid of you, Belle. I will wear your skin if I have to. I will be you soon, and you will be no more.
Katie was discharged to another hospital the following day. Things were quiet the next couple of days, and I was stripping Katie's bed to prepare for the next patient. A folded up paper, along with an eraser, fell out of her pillowcase. It was a graphite drawing of me she did during that first art group 7 months ago. I have never seen it before now. There was some eraser residue on it, and it was smudged on one side of my face. She was starting to erase it. Me. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. We've hit 200,000 subscribers, guys. Wow, I can't believe how quickly this channel is growing. Every day I wake up, it just seems like hundreds and hundreds of people are joining the Beehive. I see thousands of people just leaving likes, comments, watching the video, and interacting here on the channel. It's just amazing, guys, and 200,000 people. That's such a huge number. I can't even comprehend that. That's like more than any sporting arena here in Australia. That's just insane. Oh my gosh. You guys are just awesome. Thank you guys so much for your support. And thanks again to the Hive members as well that bravely shared their story for us all to hear. And for the chance to have your story feature in a video, you can send your story to my email, which is in the description below. And as always, keep them coming, guys, as this channel relies upon your stories to continue. And please do me a favor and just state in your email what your story is about in the description, and also provide me with a short written statement of consent so that I can just be above board with everything. And remember to tell me in the email if you'd like to remain anonymous, and also change any names if you don't want particular names to be shared. So 2 video genres I now am wanting to cover are still, one of them is the hacking stories, guys, so if you've got any of those particular stories, please send them through. And also, guys, I thought I'd open up a platform for social media stories again. I know you guys really enjoyed those stories previously before all the copyright stuff went down, so the social media stories can be anything from Facebook, Twitter, Omegle, Kik, Snapchat, dating apps, anything really, guys. So if you have a story that would fit under either of these genres, I'd love to hear from you. But remember, guys, even if you don't have this type of story, please continue to send your story in anyway, because I'd really love to hear it. And guys, it would be awesome if you could like, share, comment, and subscribe if you're new. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates throughout the week. You can also catch me on my second gaming channel, all of which have links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you mates in the next one.
It started off on Omegle. I'm an 18-year-old at the moment. Since I turned 13, I developed a habit of talking to strangers online. Every day after coming home from school, I used to talk to the numerous idiots, some decent people, some creeps, but nothing as bad as this. For some backstory, I generally followed a similar routine on most days. Monday to Thursdays, it was go to school, come home, and then just watch a few episodes of Friends or The Middle. On Fridays, I usually went out and chilled with my friends. Saturdays was just the day I went to the town centre where there were usually a lot of shops, cinemas and whatnot. I preferred to go out by myself on this day, though occasionally I went with friends. I just got home, jumped onto the computer, switching on my usual choice of music and just unwinding from a rough day at school. I watched some YouTube videos, a few episodes of Friends, and then after eating proceeded to go onto Omegle. After a few strangers and perverts, I came across a decent guy called Chris. Now Chris and I exchanged messages for about 40 to 50 minutes when I just told him a little bit about myself. Just some general information, nothing specific to be honest. Things I like to do, and that was basically it. He told me he was 18 years old and working at an ICT company as an apprentice. He seemed to have many of the same interests I did, which was a little cool because it gave us a lot to talk about. I casually told him that my web browser was acting up, to which he said, "Hey, I'm great with computers. My job involves working with them. You should totally download this application and I'll see what I can do for you if you want." Me being as innocent as I was, I agreed. The application he told me to download was either TeamViewer or Splashtop Streamer. The reason I wasn't hesitant was because there wasn't anything on my computer, no personal details, just some schoolwork and video games. It was pretty neat that he could just control my computer. I messaged Chris saying that I'm popping downstairs for 5 minutes and that I'd be right back. I came back in within 3 minutes, seeing him erasing my web history. This didn't seem sketchy as I had a problem with my browser. I asked him after he was done what he was doing and he said that the problem is all fixed, and it was. I thanked him and we spoke for about 20 minutes more. We planned to speak the following evening with some tags so the system matched us together. The next evening, we proceeded to speak. This time, however, he started acting up, asking why I was late. I said I was going to come online at 8 PM. I don't remember the exact time, but I know for a fact that I wasn't even that late, max 15 minutes. I told him not to speak to me like that, and asked why he was acting like a fucking idiot for. He went on saying, "Sorry, honey, I hope you can forgive me. I love you." Now, I'm not into guys, and these messages were freaking me out. I told him to stop, and he just sent me a few smiley faces. He then went on to say, "I know where you live. I know what school you go to," and things of that sort. Our town is a small one, and there wasn't any way that he could have guessed that. Things were uneventful for the next few days, until the following Saturday when I went shopping with some friends. We all grabbed something to eat and then just sort of chilled on one of the benches chatting. A man then popped next to us, asking if he could sit down. I was a little apprehensive, but my friend said that they were public seats and we shouldn't stop him. He was standing on my friend's side, but when we allowed him to sit, he shifted right next to me. He just sat still there, not moving, not saying a word, but just looking straight ahead. He then turned toward me and smiled. I tried to get up, but he grabbed my shoulder, to which my friend started shouting. He then started shouting himself, directly in my ear, and casually walked away. My friends walked me home that night, but it got worse then. Someone started posting blank letters through the letterbox. We started getting random bangs on the door, and when we went out, there wasn't anyone there. When I passed my driving test, I got a letter congratulating me. It was typed up. We still get the letters, just not as frequently, and the police seem not to have believed a single word, but it's supposedly being investigated. When I was young, I lived in quite a small town in Queensland, Australia. The whole town was surrounded by bush in every direction for hundreds of kilometres, and we had so much room to play. This particular story is about the first time we got drunk. In the winter, the level of the water would drop significantly, enough for us to camp in the riverbed. My best mate's parents owned a pub at the time, so we were in charge of getting drinks for a little camping trip we had planned, so we could finally pop our drunk cherry. The place we had in mind was out near an old indigenous settlement, so we made our way down into the riverbank, which was low on the side we came in on, and really high on the other side. You couldn't see on the other side through all of the trees on the top, and it was kind of unnerving knowing someone could be there, watching, and you wouldn't even know. There are about 7 of us kids in the camp, and our parents have no idea where we are or what we're doing. We lied and said that we were staying at a friend's place. We set up our camp and built a shelter for all of us to sleep under. We are all set up and start drinking as the sun is setting. Soon it's dark and we're in full swing of mixing drinks and singing songs and throwing stuff in the water, and generally making a whole heap of noise. As we're starting to wind down, one of my friends says that he saw something move at the top of the riverbank on the steep side. We all say that he's full of shit and should calm down, but he is adamant that there is someone up there, so we all start calling out, "Come out, you pussy!" and other such things, being brave well beyond our years. To our surprise, a bearded man wearing straggly clothes and no shoes came out of the tree line, stands on the edge of the bank and just stares at us. We all go silent, waiting for him to do something, but for about 5 minutes he just stands there, and then he retreats back into the tree line. We all talk amongst ourselves and get a bit nervous, but we soon forget it. About an hour later, the guy is back, but he isn't on the bank anymore. He is coming out of the shadows from the other side of the bank and entering our camp. He comes over and stands next to the fire, just joins our group of 12-year-old kids and stands there. We're all officially a bit scared and don't really know what to do, so we just sit there in silence. Eventually one of my friends gets up the courage to speak to him. "G'day mate, how are you? Are you okay?" The guy just stares at my friend and then starts staring at each of us in turn for a little bit. My friend tries again. "Hey, are you okay? What's your name?" The man snaps his head back at my friend and stares at him, wide-eyed for at least 2 minutes before answering. Without blinking, he says in a raspy whisper, "That's none of your fucking business." And then he hisses like a cat. Then this guy just jumps back screaming and staring at the fire like it had just appeared, and runs off up the steep bank in record time. It was impossible to get up this thing, so we all stand there, speechless. We decided that it's best if we just stoke the fire up because it's about a 19-kilometer walk in the pitch black back to town, and we weren't confident on that. So stoke the fire we did. We sat up for as long as we could keep watchful, not really talking. We all eventually dozed off, one by one. When we woke up in the morning, everything was gone. All of our alcohol, all of our bags, our shoes, and all of our blankets. I mean, everything. The creepy thing was that none of us awoke as someone robbed us blind. There was not one single footprint. We were sleeping in wettish sand, so there would have been footprints everywhere, but there were none. Honestly, it looked like we hadn't even been there. Needless to say, we bailed and ran most of the way back to town. Our feet were all cut up and messy by the time we got back. We never told our parents about our camping trip, and I think that we never will. One night I had fallen asleep on my back, which is very unusual for me. I tended to sleep on my side, but for whatever reason this time I didn't. While I slept, I kept my small box fan on because it was a warm night and I hate the feeling of overheating. I began to dream in my dream that I was preparing dinner for my family in the kitchen. One of my sisters, who was pregnant at the time, was standing outside of my bedroom. She opened the door and out ran my black cat, which must have surprised her because she screamed. I began to laugh in my kitchen and said, "It's just Binks." I said this as I walked from the kitchen to the hallway to see if my sister was okay, and that's when my dream began to get weird. My sister was staring into my room, which was much darker than it should have been. "No," she whispered, "there's something in your room." I wiped my hands on a small towel and walked over to my room. "There's something in your room," she repeated as I stared along with her. As I looked into the pitch-black room, everything seemed to get foggy. "There's something in your room," she said again as I kept on looking. Toward the back of my room, I started to see something. A glowing pair of red eyes in the dark. As the eyes became clearer, I began to remember something, or feel like I was remembering something. It was like my brain was trying to bring up something that was forgotten a long time ago. My sister's voice kept saying, "There's something in your room," over and over again. Each time she repeated it, she said it faster and faster. Her voice faded and became the swooshing sound of the blades of my fan. The small fan was going way faster than its highest setting. It's going so quick that it's shaking and thudding against the wood of my nightstand. I opened my eyes, and that's when I felt a hand cover my mouth and something pin me down on my bed. It felt like someone was holding every one of my limbs to stop me from moving. A loud ringing began to go off in my ear, and I could hear my heart beating rapidly in my chest. I started to fight and move my head and try to break free from whatever was holding me down. It was getting hard for me to breathe, and after what seemed like forever, I managed to escape the hand on my mouth and let out a yell. I fell out of bed and landed on the floor. I stumbled to my feet and ran out of the room. As I made my way through the house, I turned on every light, as if this would help in some way. In the back of my mind, I thought it was just sleep paralysis. To make myself a little better, I walked back to my room, turned on the light and began to speak. I said, "If there are any spirits in this room who wish to do me harm, you're not welcome here." I repeated that over and over before I sat back down on my bed. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. One of the reasons why is because I could feel something staring at me through my window. I felt like if I turned around to look out my window, I would see whatever it was that was holding me down. A day had passed when my neighbor came knocking on my door. She told my mum that she'd been trying to call because one of her security cameras showed what looked like a man standing outside my bedroom window at 3 a.m. When I was told about it, my sister's words started to repeat themselves in my head. "There's something in my room." The Indigenous people of Australia have up to 75 different dialects depending on the region where they come from, so the name of this being could be called something entirely different in other dialects, but my local tribe called it the Kardashy Man. Growing up in an outback town, you get a lot of freedom you take for granted, but that freedom could also get you into trouble. Big trouble. This occurred when I was about 11 years old in my hometown. My Aboriginal friend and I were walking around town bored out of our brains during the school holidays, so we decided to go fishing in a secret spot down by the old Aboriginal encampment, which was about 15 kilometers out of town. We headed around to the butchery to pick up some meat for Yabbies, to his house for rods and traps, and then my house for food, drinks and a shovel. We planned to dig for worms out by the river. We got all the necessary supplies and headed out along the side of the highway. We were walking and talking and stuffing around when we finally got there. We headed down the sand road and came across the fence that blocked the sacred land. There was a statue of some sort on the boundary. My mate stopped and said a few words. He always said that his dad told him to do it, otherwise the bad spirits could see us. I told him that was silly and skipped it. We go back down the camp and walk on another kilometer or so and find our spot. All the noises of the bush were there. There was a nice breeze blowing through the old ghost gums. We saw the fish jumping and knew that we were in for a good day. We start digging around for worms and come up with a few good big ones and get to fishing. The day gets on and it turns out that we are terrible fishermen with rods, so we abandon them and get in the water to catch with our hands. Turns out I'm also terrible at that, but my mate ends up catching a decent sized yellowbelly, so we keep it for eating and showing off. We hadn't kept an eye on the time, and before we knew it, the sun had set. My friend starts getting really nervous, saying that it's time to get out of there, we really need to leave. I ask why, and he says that it's really unsafe to be there after dark. I laugh, and at that exact moment, there is a huge splash in the water behind us. We both shit a little bit, but with our child bravery, we check it out and can't see a thing, just ripples on top of the water. We dismiss it as a big fish and start to pack up our stuff to leave. By the time we start our march back, it's pitch black. We can barely see our hands in front of us and forget to pack a torch, so we kind of fumble our way through the bush until our eyes adjusted. We were walking for about 20 minutes when we stop. We can hear heavy footsteps off to our left about 15 meters away. We strain our hearing and the footsteps stop. We then realize that the bush is silent. No wind. Nothing. Our eyes have adjusted to the dark so we can kind of see where we're going. We realize that we have overshot the road by about half a kilometer, and whatever was making the footsteps was between us and the road. So we decide to push on and come out along the highway further up the road. That was a mistake. The footsteps kept persisting, sometimes closer and sometimes further away. I swear at times that I could hear low mumbling. I kept telling this to my friend, but he told me to shut up and don't look back. It can't see us. So I push on, my feeling getting more and more uneasy. The next second, we hear a loud crash come from our left on the small animal trail we were on, and my mate grabs me and pulls me off into the scrub and tells me to lay down. As we're laying there, we see a silhouette loom up to the path. It kind of has the outline of feathers on it, and is godly tall and humanoid, but sickly thin. It's going from tree to tree, not very far from us, and is looking all around, snapping its head and making a low mumbling sound as it moves. It was looking for us. It keeps moving around where we were standing, and suddenly stops and stoops, looking back down the path where we hear what could have been a kangaroo jump off into the bush. The being lets out an unearthly scream that hurts our ears and shoots off down the path faster than anything I've ever seen. I looked to my mate and whispered to him if he had just seen what I had. When I looked, he had his head in his hands the whole time. He answered, "We're not allowed to look." His cheeks were all tear-stained. Then he whispered, "I told you he would see you." We waited for what felt like 2 hours, and bailed out of the bushes and ran the remaining distance to town, losing our fish along the way and some of our stuff. We finally made it, and every time I tried to bring it up with him, he told me to shut my mouth or he would come back. So eventually, I just stopped trying. I've never been able to sleep right since. I went out pigging with one of my best mates all the time, but this one time, the dogs lose their shit and go to jump off the back, so we stop and let them loose, and they shoot off like they're on the trail of something beside a really tall dam bank, so we think we're onto some pigs. We were standing there and could hear their bells off in the distance getting further away. And then, nothing. The bush was silent and we started to get a bit unnerved. We felt okay because we were holding loaded guns, but it was still an uneasy feeling. We stood listening for about 10 to 15 minutes and could not hear a thing. It was almost suffocating, so my mate started calling his dogs in. He's calling for a good 15 minutes and we still hear nothing. So he says, "Fuck this, we're going to look for them." As he turned to the car, we hear the bells come from behind us in the tree line, which we thought was weird because it was the opposite direction to which the dogs had left. So we turn around listening, and my mate starts calling out to them to come, and from behind us comes the dogs, without their bells. Needless to say, we both shat bricks and throw them on the car and bail to the other side of the place. The whole time the bells were jingling like something had them on. Weird thing was, we were a good 400 kilometers from the closest civilization, so we shit absolute bricks and were uneasy for the rest of the night. I'm really curious if anyone else experienced anything like this. I work as a doorman and have done so for about 5.5 years. Money's not exactly amazing, but it's my job. It would be great if I could get a full-time job to pay my child maintenance, but unfortunately, in the area I stay in Scotland, they ain't exactly handing out jobs, so you can imagine that times are a bit tough. However, there was a time where I loved the job. It was great at the start, up until about 2 years ago. Let me take you back a couple of weeks before the incident. Okay, so it's a freezing cold January, still snowing, and you can see your breath when you're breathing. Your hands are cold and you're all stiff. And you're outside for 12-hour shifts, checking people's IDs and putting up with a lot of grief when rejecting drunk people. So I remember this one time, I had met a guy at my regular venue, and I saw him all the time, every weekend in fact. But we had never spoken, apart from the odd hi mate, when walking past one another. So I was standing at the front door one night, freezing my balls off when he came out and approached me and started talking over a cigarette. It turned out he was a good lad and we had a great laugh. This happened for about 2 weeks, but at the same time, I had my eye on my now girlfriend. She kept looking across the bar and I would catch small glimpses of her doing it, and I knew that we both liked each other. So she came out and started talking to me, and this began happening every weekend and during the week even. And so, it wasn't long before we began seeing each other, and I couldn't be more happy. I had been seeing Amy for a good 3 weeks and hadn't heard anything from the guy since me and my missus had got together. So one weekend, I came in to look for him, and he was nowhere to be seen. I went to see the management and asked them if they had seen him, and they hadn't seen him in weeks. So, the night in question, I was standing at the door and the snow had stopped and it was about midnight and I hear the door behind me open as though someone was leaving. So I turned and went to say thank you guys, and saw him standing there with a weird smile on his face. I said to him, "Where have you been hiding?" But he was very blunt with his response and it didn't quite sit right with me. Anyways, he had a cigarette and nothing more was said. The missus was in the house on this night, so he finished his cigarette and walked back inside and out the back door. Once it hit 1 o'clock, I did the usual, "Right guys, finish your drinks and head to the exit please." Once everyone had left, I locked up the pub, said goodbye to the manager and bar staff, and put my headphones in and proceeded to walk home. The quickest way to get home was along the side of a Tesco store, and it wasn't very well lit. So I'm walking down there and singing to myself, as you do when you're all alone. Not really paying attention to where I was going, and I banged into someone, took my headphones out to apologize. And it was him. I said, "Sorry mate, see you next weekend," and proceeded to walk away and put my headphones back in, and must have done about 30 yards when I felt this searing pain in the right side of my neck, my side, and my leg. I fell to the floor and could feel blood gushing from these wounds. I remember turning over and seeing him standing there with a steak knife, just smiling. After this he walked away and I managed to get my phone out, but couldn't unlock the phone though with the fingerprint scanner or the password because I had blood all over my hands. So I typed with my nose on the screen and called an ambulance, applying pressure to my neck, as that's where I was most worried about. They were really quick in getting there and I was on my way to the hospital in no time. So I'm on my way to the hospital and my vision keeps blurring. I'm having problems breathing and my leg kept twitching. The doctors worked on me, and I can't say I remember much as I was asleep. I remember waking up the next day with a massive headache and my missus at the side of my bed. She grabbed my hand and started crying. My parents and my sisters were in the diner and came about 10 minutes later. I had to stay in the hospital for 4 to 5 days, and after the 4th, I signed myself out and headed home. I remember getting to my garden gate, putting my hand on the gate and looking up the street where it happened. I walked inside and laid down with painkillers and a cup of tea. The days passed and I started to feel a bit better and decided to go to work. And safe to say, me and the missus had a major falling out over this. But as I said earlier, money's not great. So against her wishes, I went the long way around to work. I did my shift and no sign of the guy. This happened for about 2 weeks and then when I came home one night, my missus said that strange things had been happening and she believed that someone was watching the house. I told her to stop being silly. There was nothing to worry about. The next night we're lying in bed after making love, and she's lying on my arm, head against my chest, sleeping, and I'm just about to drift off, when the whole bedroom window caves in. My missus is screaming, and I bounced up out of the bed and put my slippers on and ran down the stairs to check the front garden. When I was about to unlock the door, there was another smash from the kitchen window, so I ran to the back door, unlocked it, and looked with the light from my phone. But there was no one there. I locked the doors and went to attend to my missus. The next day, I popped out to the shop for some bread and milk, and the missus was waiting on the guys coming out to look and fix the windows. When I got home, my missus gave me a letter, so I opened it, and it read, "How dare you leave me in my time of need?" I showed her the letter, and she took it pretty badly and packed her stuff and went to her mother's. That night I'm lying in bed, just about to doze off, and I hear whistling coming from outside. It sounded creepy, so I got up and looked outside my newly fitted window, and it was some guy walking past with his hood up. Just walking past, but he got centered with the window and stopped, still whistling that creepy tune, and then he turned his head quicker than a flash up to the bedroom window to see me standing there. I'm not afraid of much, but this was crazy. I was really scared and fell back on the floor, and then I heard the front door. There were some bangs, and then that same whistling tune. I could hear the door handle being tried, and then it went silent. I waited for about 5 minutes and checked around the house, front and back gardens, and it was all clear. The next couple of nights, everything was fine. I got good sleep and I went back to work with the manager and asked what happened. I told her, as she wasn't in when I came back after the injury. About halfway through the shift, I saw a guy watching the football, back face to me, same snot green coloured jacket and brown khaki pants, and I whispered to the manager that I think that's him. She replied and told me that he has a split personality and has hurt people before, but got away with it because apparently it wasn't him committing the crimes. As the football was at half time and I had been talking to the bar staff, he came up and was all nice. He said to me, "Hey dude, long time no see, how you been?" I looked at his face and remembered that image of him standing over me with the steak knife. I don't know why, but my reply was, "Yeah, fine mate, how about yourself?" He said, "Yeah, I'm fine, can I buy a pint?" The whole time I was thinking to myself that this guy wanted to end my life and now wants to have a pint with me. I said, "Sorry, I can't do it because I'm working." He said, "Oh well," and had to go to the toilet. I was speaking to the manager, seeing if she thought it was put on or if he genuinely did have a split personality. She was just about to finish her sentence when the toilet door swung open and he came out with a terrible facial demeanour. He raised his arms, storming towards me with the same knife, but this time I got the better. As he swung at me, I broke his elbow and made him drop the knife and restrained him on the floor and called the police. They came and took him away. I haven't seen or heard anything about him for over 2 years now. Last thing I did hear was that he was put into a mental hospital. Me and my missus got back together again and have since moved house and had a beautiful baby girl, and are expecting our second anytime soon. I suppose that the main point of this story is, don't judge a book by its cover. I thought this guy was the nicest man alive, but he tried to take my life, and then offered me a pint and tried to take my life a second time. Be careful who you let into your life. I know it's a lot harder for me to trust new people nowadays. A few years ago, my brother-in-law bought another apartment complex in Florida. He owns a few apartment complexes in West Palm Beach, Miami, etc. So when he told me that he bought another one and wanted me to manage it, I figured, why the hell not? I had just graduated college with my degree and planned to go get my master's, so I figured I could manage his place and do graduate school. When he booked my flight to Orlando, I was stoked. I love Disney, and I dreamed about buying a year pass and checking out all the neat parks. When we got there, we drove out to Orlando and I had a bad feeling. He bought the apartments in a town called Leesburg. It's only an hour or so from Orlando. It's if a biker town in a retirement community had a baby. I was a little disappointed that I was an hour from Orlando with its nightlife, clubs and whatnot. I made it to work though, and soon settled into life, managing a small apartment complex. I had my one-bedroom apartment in the corner, and then there were 10 other tenants. Most were older folks, snowbirds and retirees that spent their days golfing and swimming in the pool we had. There were 2 military families, one with small kids. And then there was Andy. Andy was an enormous man. I'm a pretty big guy, 6'4", 250 pounds. But he was at least 6'6" and 400 plus pounds. He walked with a cane and had long black hair he had put in a ponytail. He worked from home, or so he said, but rumour was that he was on a disability after a horrible work accident. I really didn't care. He paid his rent on time, he was quiet and he kept to himself. I was only in his place once when his AC cut out, and to my surprise, it was pretty neat. There were no food containers or pizza boxes, beer cans, etc. that I expected a big guy like him to have laying around. Things in our complex went pretty good for the next year, until one night in November. It was raining, like it always does in Florida, and it was about midnight when someone rang on my doorbell. I looked out and saw one of my tenants, Joseph. Joe was one of my retirees who retired to Florida to, in his words, play golf and drink beer. Normally he was all smiles and jokes, but that night his face was pale and he looked frightened. I hate to bother you, Sam, but something ain't right with Andy. I put my jacket on and followed him to his apartment since Andy was his neighbour. He put his finger to his lip and motioned for me to listen. I put my ear up to the door and heard Andy fighting with someone. It sounded like whomever he was fighting with was throwing things. I was taken aback as he never had a guest over, ever, in the year he had lived there. So I knocked and heard him stomp over to the door and open it. He looked, well, normally he was very well dressed, put together, and like I said, he wasn't a messy guy. But he answered in a shirt that had grease stains, his hair was limp and greasy, and he smelt like B.O. I peered in behind him and saw that his place was a disaster. I asked if everything was okay. He was irritated and told me that it was, and pretty much shut the door in my face. I sent Joe back into his place and told him to let me know if he heard anything else, and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to pay Andy a visit to see if he was okay, and so I went by his place and knocked. There was no answer, so I decided to try back later. I got busy doing other things, and then forgot all about it. December rolls around, and I'm starting to get the monthly rent checks. None from Andy. That got me a bit worried. He was always on time with his checks. So I knocked on his door, and nothing. I knocked again, and I heard grunting and moaning. Now, I should have called the police first, but I didn't. I opened the door with my keyring, and was hit with the foulest smell ever. It smelled like piss, shit, vomit, and B.O., all rolled into one nasty smell. The walls were streaked with what I assume was shit, and the place was trashed. I start calling for Andy while dialing 911, and I hear the moaning from the back bedroom. I can never unsee what I saw, and to this day, I get flashbacks. Andy was naked and laying on the floor of his room on some dirty clothes. He was covered in his own shit and piss, and there were piles of vomit on the carpet. That was bad, but what was the clincher was that he was covered in bites, human bites, all over his arms, legs, and they were starting to smell with infection. He was also bleeding from his rectum. I wondered who attacked him. Was it the woman we heard him fighting with? I didn't get my answer until a few days after. He had been rushed to the hospital and was fighting for his life in the ICU. The doctors talked to his sister, who turned out to be his medical guardian, and things slowly came into place. Turns out, Andy did that to himself. He suffered from multiple mental disorders. He stopped taking his meds in the month before November. There was no other person that night that he was arguing with himself. Those bites he inflicted himself, the bleeding in his rectum from inserting a foreign object in there, and doing so much damage it ruptured his internal organs. He ended up pulling through and went home to live with his sister. I had the task of cleaning his apartment, and what I found while cleaning pretty much freaks me out as much as finding him. He had a shoebox full of cutouts from magazines, old family photos, and even photos he obviously took of the residents in the apartments, including myself. All of the eyes were burnt out with cigarettes, and on some of them, X's were put over the mouths. I'm not sure if that was part of his mental decline, or if he was always that creepy, and I just never noticed it. This took place about 5 years ago, when I was 23 years old. At this time in my life, I was pretty out of control. I didn't know I was bipolar, so I put myself in situations that were not the best. I had a boyfriend of 3 years that was off and on every other week. He was straight edge and pretty boring. Whenever I wanted to go out, it was always a fight. He would cry because I would go out to the bar, and then by the next week, we would be back together. One night I was leaving the salon, I'm a hairdresser, and decided I wanted to go out. It was a long week and I needed to blow off some steam, so I called up my best friend Nicole and told her to meet me at the bar near my house. This bar was known for its really strong drinks and was full of townies. We never went there before, but I figured why not try it out because of how close it was. So that night I got in a huge fight with my boyfriend and we broke up again. This time was different though. I had enough of the back and forth and really decided to move on. When Nicole and I got to the bar, we looked around. There were a lot of people in groups and they definitely noticed us. We didn't care and ended up getting pretty messed up. There was a deck where everyone smoked on, so we decided to go out there and try to meet people. I remember the moment I saw him. He was coming up the stairs and I instantly was attracted to him. It was almost like my breath was taken away as soon as we locked eyes. There was something different about him, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I needed to get to know him, so I introduced myself, and the rest was history. At the end of the night, Matt asked me and Nicole if we wanted to come over. He had a friend with him, so I figured we could keep partying. Also, his house was only a mile up the road. We hit it off really fast. I started going to his house after that night, almost every day. Before I knew it, I was practically moved in. He lived in an in-law style apartment with his grandparents on the top floor. They were fine with me just moving in, and that's when things started to turn. It was slow, but before I knew it, he was telling me what to do and what to wear. One day after work he freaked out on me for coming home late and ended up calling me just some fat bitch. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I leave? I'm not sure, but between all of the verbal abuse that started, I went from skinny to unhealthy looking. After about 4 months of verbal abuse, I decided to pack my things and move back home. Matt walked in the door as soon as I had my bags packed and freaked out. He said if I left him, he would kill himself. I thought he was joking, so I continued to get my stuff together. This is when he went into the kitchen and took a knife out. He started to cut himself right in front of me. He was screaming, "I dare you to leave." I was scared and not sure what the hell to do. His grandmother even came down to try and calm him. I think she knew that there was something wrong with him, but continued to deny it. I found this so bizarre, but I stayed. I think Matt realized I couldn't take it anymore, so one day, after work, he bought me a cat. I think he thought if he bought me an animal, because I loved animals, I wouldn't leave. Well, the week after he bought the cat, I was stuck at the salon late, doing hair. My phone had missed 50 calls and frantic texts. When I got home, I saw poop all over the bed. The cat was nowhere to be found, and Matt was in the shower freaking out and talking to himself. I asked him what the hell was going on. He said the cat pooped on my bed, and he locked it in my dresser. I was so freaked out and afraid, I didn't know what to do. I opened the dresser and the cat was covered in piss and poop. The once friendly cat was shaking and scared. I knew something happened in my gut. I knew he did something to that cat. This cat was well behaved and the mess on the bed looked like something struggled, not just an accident. After that point, the cat would not go near him and run if he came close to him. I decided that night I had to leave. I was scared, but we had a trip to go to the lake to see my grandfather that weekend. I really needed to go on the trip because he had cancer, and this would probably be the last summer that I saw him. I decided after the trip that I would pack up and that would be the end of it. I even made sure that my mum knew that I was coming back home. I knew Matt could tell that something was wrong because the whole ride up, it felt tense and uneasy. When we got to the lake, he freaked out because it was in the middle of nowhere. I told him there was a town nearby that had bars and a beach. We decided to go there for our first night. Up to this point, Matt never drank in front of me, probably because of the issues he tried to hide. But that night, he ended up getting hammered. I remember sitting on the beach, and he said,
"Do you know what happened to my ex-girlfriend's cat when she dumped me? I killed it and left it in a trash bag."
Then he said his grandparents knew because you can tell when a dead body is in a bag. At this point, I was legit freaking out. It was now confirmed that he was a sociopath, and I'm in the middle of nowhere with him. I tried not to overreact, but I wanted to get back to my grandfather's house, and fast. We got in the car and I started to drive towards the cabin. Matt grabbed the wheel and said, "I know you're going to dump me, you bitch." As he said this, he jerked the wheel so hard the car went out of control. I hit an old rock fence and my tire went flat. I went out to see the damage and Matt got out of the car as well. He proceeded to tell me if he killed me, no one would hear me scream. I was scared and trying to back away from him. He then lunged at me and started to punch my face. He kept hitting and kicking me until I fell in the street. I screamed help as loud as I could. I knew that he was going to try and kill me. Thank God that there was a motel up the road and someone yelled out that they were coming and to hold on. This spooked Matt, so he took off into the dark, dense woods. I was taken to the hospital that night with a broken nose and leg, plus a concussion. Matt was found by police dogs hiding deep in the woods. After I was well enough to get out of the hospital, I pressed charges. I had to leave my family's house because he continued to stalk me and got arrested. He would leave letters on my door saying that it wasn't over and he wanted to marry me. I had to leave my job because he would call and harass me. Everyone I worked with was freaked out, so I decided to quit. Every time there was contact, he would go to jail, to the point where, over a span of 6 months, he went to jail 5 times. Eventually, our trial came up. He knew he was guilty and my lawyer said that he was definitely going to do a lot of time. He also would need to pay all of my medical expenses. When it was time for court, he never showed up. Everyone in my family was confused, till my lawyer said that we'll not be having a trial today. I guess the night before court, Matt freaked out and decided to kill himself. I'm still not sure how, nor do I care. I guess he couldn't face jail or seeing me again. I remember he always said that jail scared him the most. It's sad, but I felt relieved in a weird way. I'm glad that he can't hurt anyone or anything ever again. I grew up on an island in Alaska, and I lived on the same property since birth to high school graduation. Our house was 2 stories, and the downstairs had a bathroom, furnace room, storage room, entryway, and rec room. One of the walls had some plywood pieces up, so we could feed extension cords through it to our crawl space. We had a C-shaped driveway that you would enter from one side and then park in the carport and then just drive forward to the exit. The crawl space consisted of 2 big water tanks because we caught our own rainwater. We also used this area for storage. The space was 10 by 15, but only 3 feet high. You had to lift a cover up to get into the water tanks. You could only enter the crawl space from one side of the house. It was a 2x2 door that we kept a master lock on, but never actually locked it. Our dog Brewster's area was on this side of the house as well. He had a big fenced area, his own stairway and porch which was half covered, and he had a doghouse. Brewster was a chocolate lab mix who weighed 130 pounds. He was a fantastic dog who only barked when necessary. During the summer, we had black bears in our yard most nights, and Brewster would give a quick bark to them to get on their way. There are 4 of us in my family, my parents, myself, and my older brother who is 2 years older and has Down syndrome. My brother was in special education at school, and there were other kids who would come into the same room, but just once in a while throughout the day, because they had a smaller disability and were able to keep up in some of the general classes. But some of the kids had discipline problems or mental illness. My brother was loved by the kids in the school and everyone knew him. One day a native kid that was about 15 came to our door and wanted to play with Travis. We thought it was odd because Travis was a moderate Downs and he didn't really like playing with other kids. He liked watching kids play. My mum asked the kid what his name was and he said his name was Mark and he knew Travis from junior high the year prior because he would go into Travis's class sometimes for help with his schoolwork. I remember him staring at me a little too much and he didn't seem like someone who was mentally challenged. My mum let him in but kept a watchful eye on them. Travis didn't seem like he wanted him there. My mum told Mark that we were having dinner soon and told him that it was time for him to go. My mum found out that he had moved into the area where we lived, but it was still a little ways away. He had been in and out of foster care most of his life. His parents were abusive addicts. I think he came over another time, and my mum felt bad for him, but she felt something was off. She felt like he was coming over because of me. My mum politely told him that Travis didn't really like having visitors and he seemed okay with that and never came over again. My parents went to a church service on Wednesday evenings and would be gone for a couple of hours. I would stay home with Travis during this time. At the time, I was 11 and he was 13. I started helping out in the church nursery when I was 9, and when I turned 11, my best friends and I took a babysitting course which included CPR and first aid. We would babysit together, and at age 12, started babysitting on our own. My mum was a homemaker and was always home except for Wednesday church service time. My parents didn't drink, do drugs, or smoke. I can only remember my parents going out a few times when we needed a babysitter. I would leave the downstairs door unlocked for my parents when they were only going to be gone for a couple of hours. I was expecting them home in a half hour and was surprised when I heard the downstairs door open, and I thought I must have not heard the car pull up, and Travis was up past his bedtime. so I quietly tell Travis to go to his bedroom and get into bed. I start walking through the kitchen to the top of the stairs and I call out, "Mum? Dad?" And I hear the footsteps stop and I'm looking down the stairs and I can see men's work boots and jeans. This isn't my parents. The way the stairs were set up, you could only see the bottom half of someone without descending the stairs. I am scared to death and I run to Travis, who is going down the hall, and I grab him and drag him to my parents' bedroom because it's the only room that locks, has a phone and rifles. Down's kids are very stubborn, so my brother just wants to go to his room, but I get him to sit down on the bed. I am trying to keep him in the room while I'm grabbing a gun and trying to call my neighbor. I can hear him walking around downstairs still. My neighbor answers her phone immediately, and I whisper that someone is in my house and I'm scared. She told me to come out onto the front porch and she'd be there. I get the courage and run to the door and get outside. Thankfully she's in our driveway and has her hound dog with her. She lets me know that she's going to enter the house through the downstairs. She disappears from sight but comes back quickly and tells me that the door is locked, so she makes her way up the stairs. She gets to the top when we hear the downstairs door open and the crunch of gravel as the intruder is running off. She lets go of her dog's leash and the dog chased the person into the woods. The dog came back 10 minutes later and our neighbor sat with us until my parents got home. The police were never called because I think my parents assumed that it was a neighbor boy screwing with me. We lived in a safe place where you just had to worry about bears and the occasional wolf. A week after this incident, our dog would bark 15 minutes after we went to bed, every night. We would look out the windows and we never saw anything. We figured it was bears because it was springtime, and Brewster was probably just getting used to them again. A couple of months pass and the barking is still happening. I had my best friend stay the night and we would always stay in the downstairs part so we could be louder and stay up late. Kate had a brother that was 17 years old, and we asked if he'd bring us some booze. I know we were young, but that was the normal thing for our town. Kids started drinking, smoking, and having sex in middle school because of boredom, I think. We got 13 feet of rain, so we would be inside a lot. It was a little after midnight and her brother never showed up, and Brewster never barked that night either. We were sitting on the stairs braiding each other's hair and we both got a feeling like someone was looking at us. And we looked over and there was a guy staring into the window. We ran up the stairs in a panic. We thought maybe it was her brother, but he wouldn't have come to the window and spied on us, and the face seemed too dark to be his. But we had the lights on in the downstairs part, and there were no lights by that window outside, so it was hard to tell who it was. We didn't wake up my parents, just in case it was her brother. We waited 30 minutes and went back down to grab our stuff and went to sleep in my bedroom for the night. The next day we talked to her brother, and it wasn't him, and that night, Brewster was back to barking again. 2 more months go by, and I had gone to bed and heard Brewster bark, and I looked out my window, and as usual, didn't see anything. I had just dozed back off and I woke up to Brewster barking frantically. I look out my window and I see a guy running out of our driveway. I thought about waking up my parents, but we had a trail on the side of our house that kids used to get to the road behind us with. The neighborhood was on the side of a mountain, so all the kids used trails to go straight through to another road instead of using the main roads. I had never seen someone come out of the part of the driveway because the trail was on the south side of the house, along with the crawl space in Brewster's area. My room was the only room on the north side. I decided to go back to sleep and I was tossing and turning. 15 minutes go by and I smell smoke. I go to the hall and the smell is a lot stronger, and it's starting to get hazy in Travis's room, which was directly across from mine. I scream, "Fire! Fire! Wake up everyone!" My parents are up, and Travis doesn't want to get out of bed, but thank God for the strength of adrenaline. We get outside and flames are pouring out of the crawl space. We get Brewster out of his enclosure, and the neighbors all come out to help us. The firemen were there rather quickly, but the fire had destroyed the crawl space and my parents' and Travis's bedrooms because they were directly over the crawl space. The firemen got the fire out, thankfully, and nobody was physically hurt. This was one of the scariest nights of my life, though. I will always remember the fire chief kneeling down to speak to me after he had talked to my parents, and he said, "Melinda, we believe it was arson." I looked at him with tears streaming down my face, and I say in anger, "Who is arson?" Everyone started laughing so hard. And I'm thinking, how is this funny? That damn arson could have killed my family. So he explained what arson was. I am still friends with the old fire chief's son, and I share that story with him often because his father passed away from cancer when we were teens. His father is the only happy memory I have from that horrific night. The island I grew up on had a city and a village out south. We lived out south, but before the village. We had firemen for out south, north, and the city. We had state troopers for the island, and city cops in the city limits. My mum took my brother and I to our family friend's house, and my dad dealt with the fire officials, and a state trooper showed up later. After the investigation, my family, neighbours, and firemen pieced together that a person had been living in our crawl space for at least 4 months. We know that he set the house on fire on purpose. He used a box of matches. My mum said the first odd thing she noticed that night was the smell of sulphur. And we also know who did it. It was Mark. His uncle was one of the firemen who first showed up at our house and saw him standing near our driveway watching. My mum told him my description of what the person was wearing that I saw fleeing from our house, and it was what he was wearing. Behind our house near the crawl space area, my dad found out where he hung out when he wasn't in the crawl space. There were a bunch of cigarette butts, cans of soda which were also found in the crawl space, but because our crawl space wasn't locked, our insurance company wouldn't pay for the repairs. Because of our water tanks, the space was supposed to be locked. So my parents never said anything to the police, and the firemen never said anything either. If we had told the truth, we wouldn't have a home today. It took 4 months for our house to be repaired, and it smelled like ozone even years later. But what bothers me the most is knowing that he had seen me and my friends undressed numerous times while changing in the rec room during tons of sleepovers. Where he had set up shop was right next to the plywood with the holes drilled through. He listened to all of our secrets. I never explained to my friends that he had seen us and heard us during our sleepovers, because I didn't want them to feel sick to their stomachs like I did, and still do. I still have issues when it comes to being home alone. I can't sleep if I'm the only adult in the house. I keep the volume on everything low. I'm scared to shower. I like to be able to see the front door, and I have night terrors to this day, and I'm 34 now. I've been dealing with anxiety since the fire and panic attacks since I was 18. Just recently, I was diagnosed with PTSD. When the intruder was in his early 20s, he was caught for burning down a few houses and was put in jail. All of my childhood toys were stored in the crawl space, along with a lot of our family's sentimental possessions. I left A's house with more questions than I had come armed with, and, probably for the first time, I was left thinking that something was amiss. This caused me to go through a period of reflecting over the events of the compound, and afterwards to build up a picture of the unknowns. What did I miss? I began doing some research about Ouija boards to understand them, and how they work. I mean, I had watched ghost TV shows, but they're just that, TV shows. I wished I hadn't have done the research as I realized the full extent and consequence of my encounter with Zozo. I feel shudders now just saying the name. After all, I read that the name gives the demon its power. While I went off in a tangent to find out all about Zozo, and raise my fear levels exponentially in the process, it never really helped me achieve my goal of trying to link the events together, especially with how they relate to the compound. I tried figuring out what the words that Zozo told me could possibly mean. Radar, Richard, CRT, photos, understand. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything about Zozo, as you can find a plethora of information by doing a Google search. But one thing that I gathered was that Zozo is usually not the type to tell me words and just leave it at that. He was leading me on to something more. I hadn't experienced any paranormal experiences directly. Anything weird that I've experienced was all of my own doing. Mainly at my own obsession of trying to piece things together, if there was even something to piece together. Thinking back, 3 of the words were relatable to my experience at the base. Radar, CRT, and photos. The base was a radar research center. I figured out as much from the documentation that was lying around, as well as the obvious radars frozen at the top of one of the big buildings. so Zozo was telling me a location. But that's not the only location. Zozo also mentioned CRT, who explored a room with CRT monitors. A, who took some weird box from the CRT room. A, who has been acting odd since leaving the base. A, who had a Ouija board with the aforementioned weird box sat next to it. A. The CRT word was probably the one that got me hooked, but the last word, photos, was the one that made an instant connection. The strange shadow in the photo with A. However, that was just one photo. Why did Zozo say photos, insinuating that there was more than one? A light bulb popped up in my head. I took 2 photos, but there was a third file which was corrupt. I immediately flashed open my laptop and connected up my camera to once again view the file contents. There were now 5 files. I felt my heart stop in that moment. I hadn't used my camera since that night, other than connecting to my laptop. The new files were a video and a text file. I was hesitant to immediately open the new file, so I first checked their properties, and was shocked when I looked when they were last modified. It matched the time I went to visit A. Now, I know my technology, and I certainly know that cameras only create and modify image files, and at no point do cameras, especially my one, create text files. I opened the text file and was simply stunned by what I read. I thought you might like your corrupt file back. You know where you need to go. It took me a few moments to build my composure back up. Several thoughts were swimming through my mind. Someone had been in my house. Someone had touched my camera. Coincidentally, the same time I was communicating with Zozo. I couldn't move. I was too scared to even blink or breathe. I didn't feel so lonely anymore, and felt millions of eyes upon me. My house, my home, my sanctuary, my safe bubble away from the darkness and evils of outside had been punctured, and this paranoia, along with my obsession, had me hanging by fingertips over the dark hole of insanity. I had to take a second to stifle my curiosity about the corrupt file and the video. Once I took a look, I was committed to this insanity which I would likely never come back from. I was committed to this instinctual urge for answers and for closure. I looked outside my window while thinking. I don't know why, but I guess everybody looks out the window on a now overcast day for some outside perspective. I was in. I got a bit more comfortable in my chair and took a breath as I double-clicked on the video file. The video was shot using a night vision camera, as it showed someone walking by a brick wall that was illuminated green. I could hear the unmistakable sound of the sea crashing against the shore. He's not where I think he is he? I see the cameraman slow down as he nears the end of the wall, peeks the camera around the corner and then shuffles around the corner. I see the cameraman shuffle around the following corner to see, to my shock, me. Whoever was holding the camera filmed me walk along the front of my big building and then continued to film as I lifted up myself and inside the building. After a few seconds, the cameraman turns away from the building and I don't see anything of interest for a minute or so until the cameraman hides around the corner and, once again, faces the camera in the direction of another person. This time it was A. I recognized the location. It was the little block of buildings that we all agreed A had to explore. From what I could see in the video, which was not much as the cameraman was positioned a bit of a distance away from A was oblivious, as I was, to being filmed. I watched as I noticed A try to open a door but found it padlocked. I noticed A's failed attempts at trying to get the door open, before I saw A bend down to pry open what looked like a vent to the bottom right next to the door. When A stood back up, I noticed he was holding a big sack. Before he opened the sack, I noticed A start to look around him, causing the cameraman to quickly slide the camera back behind the wall. A few seconds later, the camera re-emerged to show A rummaging through the sack. At this point the cameraman had zoomed in, and I could see a bit clearer. A pulled out what looked like a crowbar, and I noticed him turn it over in his hands before he slowly looked up at the door. I saw him fit the crowbar in between the door to try and pry it open, to no luck. I then saw him try and attack the padlock, again with no luck. After his failed attempts, I could see him rummaging through the sack in frustration to then pull out a cylindrical object.
A fucking blowtorch?
I heard A exclaim. My eyes widened upon seeing this. I once again saw A slowly turn over the blowtorch in his hand. like he was trying to work out how to use it, before quickly pressing the handle to cause a bright white light pierce the darkness in front of him. This seemed to catch A off guard as I watched him jump at the loud hissing being emitted from this object. As A quickly released the handle on the blowtorch, I noticed him stand still like a statue, like he was listening out for movement around him. Once he was satisfied, I saw him proceed to activate the blowtorch against the padlock on the door. I watched as the padlock turned white as A used the crowbar to pry it apart. A had done it. He was in. I watched as he slowly sprung open the door, activated his flashlight and walked into the room. I could no longer see A. At this point, I was wanting the cameraman to follow A, as I was curious to see what was inside the room. The cameraman seemed to be stood there for ages, before I suddenly heard A gasp in shock.
What the fuck?
The cameraman rushed forward, but not before the video abruptly ended with static and the accompanying noise. I sat there in silence as I digested what I had just seen in the video. What did A see in that room? What was in that room that the cameraman didn't want A to see? Did A encounter the cameraman? Why didn't he tell us? I also had another thought regarding A and the blowtorch he found, but not before looking at the Corrupt No Longer file to confirm my suspicions. I fired open the file and cited what I saw. It was a black and white still photograph of A midway through cutting one of the 3 lines that we had seen on the metal blind in the kitchen of the compound. My suspicions were confirmed. Seeing this photo caused me to sit back abruptly in my chair and stare in a mix of disbelief and disgust. I also felt a little betrayed. Why did A do it? I must admit I was completely and utterly dumbfounded and was not sure how to proceed forward from this. I know that I now had a burning desire to 1. Find out what A saw inside the CRT room, and 2. Find out who had been filming us. Both thoughts were equally as creepy as each other, but I felt like the missing link to the puzzle could be found in the CRT room. As I said earlier, I was now committed to the cause of figuring out the loose ends from our exploration of the compound. I knew that opening these files and playing along with this game set up by the cameraman would be the only way that I could get closure, and, maybe, find a way to get the original A back. I had to get my shoes and coat on. It's this commitment which had led me to the very drastic action I needed to do. I reflected back on the video and photos I had seen, the strange shadow, the cameraman and A's strange behavior, as I walked along the shoreline, psyching myself up to enter the compound one last time. As I was about to get near to the entrance, my phone started ringing. It was A. I felt like I needed to start the conversation with him by telling him what I had seen in the video and in the photo, but the timing, it didn't feel right. I felt like I still needed some more evidence before potentially getting into another argument with him. This thought ended up being thrusted to the back of my mind, as the conversation with A would cause things to take an even more sinister turn. I swiped to answer the call.
C.
A started, rather hurriedly.
C, where are you? Are you somewhere safe?
Define safe, I replied, looking in front of me at the base. I was the opposite to safe, but what does safe even mean anymore? Why? What's up, pal?
Okay, I need you to listen to me and not question me at this time. Can you do that?
A told me, quite domineeringly. I felt that all too familiar sinister atmosphere surrounding me once more as I psyched myself up for what I was about to hear. Go right ahead, I replied, quickly.
So, I didn't tell you the exact story about my mum, but you have to hear me out. My mum was involved in an accident in her car, yes, but it wasn't because someone went through a red light. She was driving down a country lane when it seemed that she had swerved to avoid someone, and ended up flipping her car with her inside it. She ended up crushed between the roof and the top of her seat. And the thing is, man, the person who did it left a fucking note. And I think it's a person who's been following me for a while. I don't want to go into details right now, but things just haven't been right since that night. I feel like we've been disturbing something.
He said in quick sentences, barely pausing for breath. I felt super vulnerable now, but I pretended not to show it. Okay, man, keep calm. What did the note say? I wondered. I heard A choke up.
It said, you took from me, I take from you.
A's words, or rather, the note's words, hit me like a fucking truck. I heard A begin to sob.
She's dead, man. He killed her. They killed her.
I fell silent for a few seconds. I'm so sorry, man. Those words were all I could muster. I shortly closed off the call, not long after that, amid some awkward, tense silence. I was crippled with fear, and what made it worse was that I was stood about a couple of 100 meters away from the source of all that fear, pain, and pure unfiltered horror. The text file on my camera ended with the line, "You know where you need to go." So there I was. I was in too deep, and I was entirely alone. I'm an American-born woman, but my mother was born in South Africa, having immigrated in the 90s. Growing up, she always taught me to be on guard and to be extremely cautious. It was simple things, like driving up to the ATM at night. While my mum was using the machine, I had to look out of one window while my sister would look out of the other, so that we could see if someone was coming. I had always wanted to visit South Africa, and when I was 17, I went as a graduation present. I ended up staying with my grandparents, who were both in their late 70s. My grandmother was hell-bent on showing me as much of the country as possible, even though my grandfather's Alzheimer's was worsening and travelling was becoming harder. Regardless, though, we took off from Johannesburg towards Cape Town. We would drive up to 6 hours at a time, and anyone who's been to South Africa knows that you can go hundreds of miles and see nothing but grass. It was incredibly beautiful, but also really eerie. Once we drove into wine country in the Cape, we began passing signs that said, "Don't pull over for people selling grapes," as we were near vineyards and people would steal grapes and then sell them on the side of the road. Around hour 3 or 4 of the day, my grandfather was getting antsy. He was obsessing with the GPS of the car, plugging it in and unplugging it, cursing and getting frustrated. Eventually, the thing just kept repeating, recalculating for hours on end. My patience was wearing thin, and I was trying to take it from him so I could fix it, but he wouldn't let me touch it. Finally, my grandmother had had enough and pulled over. This stretch of road was narrow and lined by trees. It was probably mid-afternoon by now, but we were the only car in sight, and it was completely silent. My grandparents were reading the GPS instructions and arguing when my grandmother turns around. "Keep watch out of the back window." I kind of smiled to myself, remembering what my mum used to say. I glanced at my phone, which had no service, and scrolled through my camera roll for the 300th time that day. I casually looked up and turned towards the back window, and my heart stopped. A man had come out of the forest and was running full sprint at our car. I found my voice and yelled, "Go!" to my grandmother, and her instincts kicked in, and we just took off. We drove away, and the man was just left standing there. My grandmother explained that often, when travellers pulled over for the grape sellers, there would be people waiting in the trees who would come out and rob you, sometimes violently too. It doesn't get much more vulnerable than a teenage girl and an elderly couple, one of which was obviously suffering with Alzheimer's. All I can say is, thank you, Mum, for making me cautious. I used to get babysat at a family friend's when I was in grade school. They lived about half a mile down the street from a cult compound comprised of Satanists. And being religious and all, it was a pretty scary thought to know that these people existed in this little mountain town of about 29,000 people. I think only a few members of the group actually lived on the property because you could see a lot of cars exit at night and not come back. There were suspicions from my dad and others that some of these members may have infiltrated some of the local churches, although it was never confirmed. The point is that no one really knew who these people were. So, one Halloween, we went trick-or-treating around the neighborhood, and my sister's friend kept saying that his cat was missing, and that he thought that it had gotten onto the cult property and that they may have even killed it. They were actually known for killing cats that got inside their walls, and they had hung them from trees and everything. Being an animal lover myself, I suggested that we climb the walls via one of the trees to see if his cat was one of the ones that were up there. They had motion lights set up, so we had to be really careful. Once over the walls, we were kind of staying near their trees to get a closer look at some of these cats. Some of them had obviously been hanging for a while, but some were obviously fresh too. They almost looked like they were being used as decorations or something. He spots his cat eventually, and becomes visibly angry and sad. Emotional and erratic, he wanted to march up to the doors of their church where they were having some sort of service or something. I talked him out of that one, and instead talked him into letting me give him a boost up to the rear window to see what was going on in there. Now, these windows were pretty small, and they were up pretty high too. So I boost him up, and after a few seconds, he lets out a gasp. This kid was known for being a little bit dramatic, so I didn't know how to take what he said. But according to him, he saw a metal tray with severed fingers and animal parts, probably a cat, laid out on said tray. He jumps down and stumbles, setting off a motion light. Almost immediately, people start flying out of this place, chasing us at full speed. We managed to get back over the walls without incident, where my sister and brother were waiting. They asked us what happened, and we told them. We also told the kid's mum, and the only part that she believed was the dead cats thing. She called the cops, and they said that those people could do whatever they wanted regarding animals on their property. She didn't mention the severed fingers because she thought it was a lie. But the cops pretty much pretended that the compound didn't exist in regards to the shit that people would report about them. Their motto regarding the cult was basically just leave them alone. My little brother and I, we walked home that night, which was about 5 miles or so. After a while, I noticed that there was a green Suburban which would drive by us every 10 minutes or so. Panicked and not wanting them to know where we lived. My mum was gone for the week for army duty. I told my brother that we need to start zigzagging through alleys and such. We eventually lost whoever it was and made it home. And I ate enough sugar to stay up until morning. I never saw any of their faces or any other kind of memorable attributes. But there were over 100 members who were all part of our community. We just never knew who they were. Last night, while I was sleeping, I was awoken up by the sound of heavy breathing. I was on my side facing away from my boyfriend, who was sleeping in the same bed. At the same time, I felt incredibly uneasy, and like someone was in the room with us. I rolled over and clearly saw a figure standing over my boyfriend, looking down at him, man breathing heavily. The breathing, it almost sounded like snarling. It was so intense. I immediately started yelling at it to go away and just to leave him alone. I don't remember exactly what I said because I was just barely awake and frankly terrified. But I threw my body over his and reached over to turn on the light. I looked away to turn on the light, and when I looked back, it was gone. My boyfriend woke up and was trying to comfort me. I was in hysterics, bawling my eyes out, and I never usually cry, so this was odd for me, and asks me what happened. And while I was explaining to him what happened and what I saw, the light turned off by itself. It's never done that before. I asked my boyfriend to turn on the flashlight on his phone to give us some light in the room, and when he reached over to do that, the light just turned back on by itself. I have lived in this apartment